Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us, click the like button, and let's get into the case. The morning sun crested over the eastern horizon, spilling golden light across the choppy North Atlantic waters. From the balcony of his stateroom on the 7th deck of the Nordic Voyager, Thomas Harrington watched as the jagged coastline of Iceland emerged from the distant mist. The volcanic landscape, stark and primordial, rose dramatically from the sea, a fitting backdrop for what the brochure had promised would be the adventure of a lifetime. Thomas took a sip from his coffee mug, savoring the bitter warmth as a crisp breeze ruffled his silver-streaked hair. At 50 years old, he had finally made good on the promise he'd made to himself decades ago, to see the land of fire and ice before he turned the corner into his 6th decade. The cruise had been expensive, but after 30 years of teaching high school biology in Seattle, he had the savings and, more importantly, the time. The gentle knock at his door pulled him from his reverie. "Just a minute," he called, sliding the balcony door closed behind him. When he opened the door, he found Eleanor, his cabin steward, with her perpetual smile. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington. I just wanted to remind you about the coastal excursion. Today, the boat leaves at 9, she said, her Icelandic accent coloring her otherwise perfect English. "Thank you, Elena. I've been looking forward to it all week." "The weather is perfect for swimming too," she added, glancing at the clear sky visible through his balcony window. "Many passengers enjoy the designated swimming area near Husavik. The waters are especially clear this time of year." Thomas nodded, though swimming hadn't been on his agenda. He wasn't the strongest swimmer, and the thought of immersing himself in the frigid Icelandic waters wasn't particularly appealing. Still, he didn't dismiss the idea entirely. Maybe it would be good to step outside his comfort zone. Isn't that what this trip was all about? "I'll keep that in mind," he said with a smile. "See you later, Elena." After she left, Thomas returned to the balcony, gazing at the approaching shoreline with a renewed sense of anticipation. He had read about Husavik, Iceland's whale-watching capital. The town sat on the shores of Skjálfandi Bay, a hotspot for cetacean activity. 15 species of whales and dolphins frequented these waters, including the magnificent orca, the apex predator of the seas. As a biology teacher, Thomas had always been fascinated by orcas. He had given countless lectures on their intelligence, their complex social structures, their hunting techniques. But seeing one in the wild would be an entirely different experience. The thought sent a thrill of excitement through him. 2 hours. Later, Thomas stood on the deck of a small tour boat, binoculars raised to his eyes as he scanned the horizon for signs of marine life. Around him, 20 other passengers from the Nordic Voyager did the same, their excited chatter creating a buzz of anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Gunnar, their guide for the day, "we are now entering an area where orca sightings have been reported consistently over the past week. Keep your eyes on the water for dorsal fins or blow sprays." Thomas adjusted his binoculars, focusing on a patch of water where several seabirds had gathered. In his experience, birds often signaled the presence of fish, and where there were fish, there might be predators. "It's unusual to see so many orcas this close to shore," Gunnar continued, his voice carrying over the soft hum of the boat's engine. "But a large herring run has drawn them in. They're smart, these animals. They've figured out that the herring are trapped between the shore and deeper waters, makes for easy hunting." Thomas listened intently, absorbing every detail. This was precisely the kind of natural phenomenon he'd hoped to witness. "There!" shouted a woman to his left, pointing excitedly. "I saw a fin." All binoculars turned in the direction she indicated. For a moment, there was nothing but the gentle roll of waves. Then, suddenly, a large black dorsal fin sliced through the surface. About 200 yards from the boat, it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the brief sighting was enough to elicit gasps of awe from the group. "That's a male orca," Gunnar confirmed. "See how tall the dorsal fin is? Must be at least 6 feet high. That's a mature bull, probably the leader of a pod." Thomas held his breath, waiting for the orca to resurface. When it did, it was closer to the boat, and this time he caught a glimpse of the animal's massive body. a sleek black and white torpedo powering through the water with effortless grace. "Magnificent," he whispered. For the next hour, the tour boat followed the pod at a respectful distance as the orcas hunted. Thomas watched mesmerized as they employed sophisticated hunting strategies, corralling herring into tight balls before slapping their tails to stun the fish. The coordination between pod members was remarkable, a testament to their intelligence and social complexity. During a lull in the action, Gunnar approached Thomas, noticing his intense focus. "You seem particularly interested in our orca friends," he observed. Thomas nodded. "I teach biology back in the States. Orcas have always fascinated me." "Then you must take advantage of our swimming area this afternoon," Gunnar suggested. "It's in a protected cove not far from here. We've set up a safety net that extends 30 feet down, well beyond where most marine life would venture. You get a unique perspective on these waters from below the surface." Thomas hesitated. "Is it safe, with the orcas being so active in the area?" Gunnar waved away his concern. "Absolutely. The swimming area is well away from the herring runs. Besides, the net is specifically designed to keep larger marine life out. In 20 years of operation, we've never had an incident." The reassurance eased Thomas's concerns, and as the tour continued, he found himself warming to the idea. Swimming in these pristine waters would be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and with safety measures in place, what could go wrong? By the time the tour boat returned to the harbor, Thomas had made up his mind. He would join the afternoon swimming excursion. After a quick lunch at a local cafe, he found himself on another, smaller boat, heading toward a sheltered cove about 2 miles from Husavik. The cove was a natural wonder, a semicircle of black volcanic rock embracing a pocket of surprisingly blue water. As the boat anchored near the center of the cove, Thomas could see the safety net marked with bright orange buoys, forming a perimeter about 50 yards in diameter. "The net extends from the surface to 30 feet below," explained Katrin, the swimming guide. "It's inspected daily for any tears or weak spots. Water temperature today is about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, brisk but tolerable with a wetsuit." Thomas and the 5 other passengers who had opted for the swimming excursion were provided with high-quality wetsuits, masks, snorkels, and fins. As he struggled into the tight neoprene, Thomas felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. It had been years since he'd gone swimming in the ocean, and never in waters this cold. "First time in Icelandic waters?" asked an older woman next to him, noticing his apprehension. "That obvious, huh?" Thomas smiled. "I was the same my first time," she said with a reassuring pat on his arm. "I'm Margaret, by the way. 3rd time in Iceland for me. The swimming is worth the initial shock, I promise." Her confidence bolstered his own, and by the time he was fully suited up, Thomas felt ready. One by one, the swimmers slipped into the water from the boat's platform. When his turn came, Thomas took a deep breath and stepped off. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath despite the protection of the wetsuit. For a moment, panic threatened to overtake him, but he forced himself to breathe slowly through his snorkel, as Katrin had instructed. Gradually, his body adjusted to the temperature, and he began to notice the incredible clarity of the water. Visibility extended at least 50 feet in every direction. Below him, the ocean floor was a tapestry of rock and colorful marine plants. Schools of small fish darted about, their silver scales catching the sunlight that penetrated the surface. It was like floating in a natural aquarium. Thomas kicked gently with his fins, propelling himself toward the edge of the safety net. He wanted to see how the structure was anchored to the seabed. As a teacher, he found himself automatically collecting mental notes for future lessons. The engineering of the net, the ecosystem within it, the adaptation of local marine species to the cold waters. He was about 15 feet from the net when he first felt it, a subtle vibration in the water more sensed than heard. He paused, treading water, and looked around. The other swimmers were scattered across the enclosed area, oblivious to whatever had caught his attention. Then he saw it, a shadow moving beyond the net, large and purposeful. His heart leaped into his throat as he recognized the unmistakable shape of an orca, its black and white pattern vivid even through the blue filter of the water. For a moment, Thomas was frozen, torn between fear and wonder. The orca seemed to be patrolling the perimeter of the net, as if assessing it. He knew he should alert the others, signal to Katrine, but the sight of this magnificent predator so close was hypnotic. The orca made another pass, closer this time. Thomas could see its eye, dark and intelligent, seemingly fixed on him. This wasn't the distant sighting from the tour boat. This was an intimate encounter with one of the ocean's most formidable hunters. He raised his head above water, pulling out his snorkel. "Orca," he called out, pointing toward the net. "There's an orca out there." His voice carried across the water, catching the attention of the other swimmers and Katrine, who was keeping watch from the boat. She immediately reached for her radio, presumably to report the sighting, while signaling for the swimmers to return to the boat. Thomas began swimming back, but curiosity made him pause for one last look. When he did, his blood ran cold. The orca was no longer patrolling beyond the net. It was testing it, nudging against the barrier with its massive body. And then, to his horror, Thomas saw a portion of the net give way. It didn't tear catastrophically, but a section near the bottom sagged inward, creating an opening. The orca hesitated, as if surprised by its success, then slowly began to squeeze its enormous bulk through the gap. "The net!" Thomas shouted, panic now evident in his voice. "It's coming through!" Katrine's face paled as she followed his pointing finger. She grabbed her radio again, her voice urgent as she called for immediate assistance. "Everyone out of the water now!" she commanded, her previous calm replaced by controlled fear. The other swimmers needed no encouragement. They swam frantically toward the boat, their splashing creating a chaotic scene on the previously serene surface. Thomas turned to follow, his heart pounding in his chest. He had only taken a few strokes when he felt it, a powerful displacement of water behind him. He knew without looking that the orca had fully breached the net and was now inside the swimming area. Training and instinct warred in his mind. As a biology teacher, he knew that wild orca attacks on humans were virtually unheard of, but as a human facing an apex predator in its element, primal fear took precedence over academic knowledge. He forced himself to swim steadily, fighting the urge to thrash wildly. Excessive splashing might trigger the orca's predatory instincts, he reasoned. Stay calm. Move deliberately. Don't panic. The boat seemed impossibly far away. Thomas could see Margaret being helped aboard, could hear Katrine's continued urgent communication on the radio. Just 50 more yards. He could make it. The displacement in the water behind him intensified. The orca was closer now, its massive body creating a pressure wave that Thomas could feel through his wetsuit. His rational mind still clung to the belief that the animal was merely curious, investigating this unusual intruder in its hunting grounds. That belief was shattered when something solid brushed against his leg. Not a casual touch, a deliberate nudge, powerful enough to push him slightly off course. The orca was testing him just as it had tested the net. Thomas abandoned all pretense of calm swimming. With desperate strokes, he propelled himself toward the boat, now just 30 yards away. Behind him, he could sense rather than see the orca circling, tightening its loop around him. Another nudge, harder this time, sent him momentarily beneath the surface. When he resurfaced, gasping, he caught a glimpse of the dorsal fin cutting through the water barely 10 feet away. It was the same tall, straight fin he'd admired from the tour boat earlier, the mature bull. "Thomas!" Katrine's voice reached him. She was leaning over the edge of the boat, arm extended. "Keep swimming, you're almost here!" Those words gave him a surge of energy, and he redoubled his efforts. 20 yards, 15. The boat was so close now. The third impact came without warning, a massive force slamming into his right side, lifting him partially out of the water. Pain exploded through his ribcage as the orca's body connected with his. He tumbled through the air before crashing back into the sea, disoriented and in agony. Water filled his mask, and for a terrifying moment he couldn't tell which way was up. He tore the mask from his face, kicking desperately until his head broke the surface. Through the haze of pain, he could see the boat, now perhaps just 10 yards away. Katrine and another passenger were reaching toward him, their faces twisted with horror and concern. Thomas tried to call out, but only a wheeze escaped his lips. His right side felt as if it were on fire, each breath sending fresh waves of agony through him. Broken ribs, certainly. Possibly worse. The Orca surfaced beside him, close enough that Thomas could feel the exhaled breath from its blowhole. Its massive eye regarded him with what Thomas could only interpret as cold calculation. In that moment, he understood with terrible clarity that this was not curiosity. This was hunting behavior. He was being treated as prey. With what strength remained, Thomas lunged toward the boat. His fingers scraped against the metal hull, seeking purchase. From above, hands reached down, grasping his wetsuit, his arms trying to pull him from the water. He was halfway out when the final attack came. The Orca surged upward from below, its massive jaws closing around Thomas's right leg. The pressure was enormous, crushing. There was a terrible cracking sound that Thomas felt more than heard, bone giving way under tremendous force. Pain, beyond anything he had ever experienced, engulfed him. He screamed then, a primal sound of agony and terror. Those pulling him aboard redoubled their efforts, literally tearing him from the Orca's grasp. As they hauled him over the side, Thomas caught one last glimpse of the predator. It hung vertically in the water, its head raised, watching as its prey was lifted beyond reach. There was no anthropomorphic malice in its gaze, no hatred, only the implacable focus of a hunter who had lost its quarry. Then darkness swallowed him, merciful unconsciousness claiming him as the boat's engine roared to life, carrying him back, toward shore and whatever fate awaited him. Thomas awoke to the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment and the sterile scent of antiseptic. His mind, foggy with pain medication, struggled to piece together his surroundings. A hospital room, obviously. But where? How long had he been unconscious? As his vision cleared, he became aware of a figure seated beside his bed, a woman in a white coat, her attention focused on a tablet in her hands. When she noticed his stirring, she looked up, offering a professional smile. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her Icelandic accent pronounced, but her English fluent. "I'm Dr. Jonsdottir. You're in Husavik Regional Hospital. Can you understand me?" Thomas tried to speak, but his throat was parched, his voice a rasp. The doctor quickly offered him a small cup of water with a straw, supporting his head as he drank gratefully. "Yes," he managed after wetting his lips. "I understand. How long?" "You've been here for 2 days," she replied, making a note on her tablet. "Most of that time under sedation. You were in surgery for nearly 8 hours when you arrived." The memories came flooding back. The swimming excursion, the Orca breaching the net, the terrifying pursuit, the final devastating attack. Instinctively, Thomas tried to move his right leg, then froze as shooting pain lanced through his body, despite the medication. Dr. Jonsdottir's expression softened with compassion. "Mr. Harrington, Thomas, I need to tell you about your injuries. The Orca's attack caused significant trauma. You have 4 broken ribs on your right side, a punctured lung that we've reinflated, and considerable soft tissue damage to your torso." She paused, clearly steeling herself for the most difficult part. "Your right leg sustained the most severe damage. The force of the bite crushed your femur and severed several major blood vessels. We did everything possible to save the limb, but the damage was too extensive. I'm very sorry, but we had to amputate above the knee." The words hit Thomas with physical force. Amputate. The clinical term hung in the air between them, its implications slowly penetrating the fog of medication and shock. His leg was gone. The life he had known, teaching, hiking the trails around Seattle, the casual independence he had taken for granted, all of it irrevocably altered in a moment of violence, beneath the Icelandic Sea. "I understand this is overwhelming news," Dr. Jonsdottir continued gently. "We have excellent psychological support services available, and once you're stabilized, we can discuss rehabilitation options and prosthetics. Modern technology offers—" "The others," Thomas interrupted. his voice stronger now, driven by sudden concern for his fellow swimmers. "Were they hurt? Did anyone else?" "No," she assured him quickly. "You were the only one injured. The quick action of the guide and the other passengers likely saved your life. They applied a tourniquet and got you to shore in record time. Emergency services were waiting at the harbor." A small mercy, Thomas thought. At least no one else had suffered. He closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened to him. He had come to Iceland seeking adventure, a break from his routine life. Now he would return fundamentally changed, carrying physical and psychological scars that would redefine every aspect of his existence. "There's someone from the cruise line waiting to speak with you," Dr. Jonsdottir added after giving him a moment. "And the local marine wildlife authorities would like to take a statement when you feel up to it, but all that can wait until you're stronger." Thomas nodded, already feeling exhaustion pulling at him despite having just awakened. The doctor adjusted his medication, and as he drifted back towards sleep, his mind filled with images of dark water and a relentless black and white shadow pursuing him through the depths. The next few days passed in a blur of medical examinations, pain management, and brief disorienting periods of consciousness. Thomas learned that he had been transferred from Husavik to a larger hospital in Reykjavik with better facilities for trauma cases. The Nordic Voyager had continued its scheduled cruise route, but the company had arranged for his medical care and eventual repatriation to the United States. On the fourth day after the attack, Thomas was awake and lucid enough to receive visitors. The first was a solemn-faced man in a corporate suit who introduced himself as Henrik Larsson, Chief Safety Officer for Nordic Cruise Lines. "Mr. Harrington," Larsson began, his tone carefully balanced between professional distance and personal concern. "First, let me express our deepest regrets regarding your accident. Nothing like this has ever occurred in our company's history." Thomas noted the word choice. Accident, not attack. Already the narrative was being shaped, responsibility diffused. "The swimming area has been closed indefinitely," Larsson continued, "and we're cooperating fully with Icelandic authorities in their investigation. The safety net had been inspected that very morning, but clearly there were unforeseen vulnerabilities." "The Orca tested it," Thomas said quietly. "It was methodical, deliberate. It found the weak point and exploited it." Larsson shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, well, the marine biologists tell us this was highly unusual behavior. Orcas don't typically view humans as prey. They speculate this particular animal may have been confused or aberrant in some way." Thomas didn't respond. He knew what he had seen in those final moments, the calculated pursuit, the precise attacks. There had been nothing confused about the Orca's behavior. It had recognized an opportunity and seized it with the efficiency of an apex predator. "Of course," Larsson continued when the silence grew uncomfortable, "Nordic Cruise Lines will cover all medical expenses not included in your travel insurance, and we're prepared to discuss additional compensation for the trauma you've experienced." The carefully worded offer hung in the air between them. Thomas understood its implications. Compensation would come with confidentiality agreements, with the corporate machine's need to manage public relations and limit legal liability. "I'm not ready to discuss that yet," Thomas said finally. "I need time to understand what my life is going to look like going forward." Larsson nodded, seemingly relieved not to have been immediately confronted with demands or accusations. He left his business card and departed with renewed assurances of the company's support. The next visitor was more welcome, Margaret, the older woman who had reassured Thomas before the swim. Her face was lined with concern as she took the chair beside his bed. "They told me you were awake," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I've been checking every day. I couldn't leave Iceland without seeing that you were still with us." Thomas managed a small smile. "Still here," he confirmed, "though not quite all of me made it." The gallows humor fell flat, and Margaret's eyes welled with tears. "Oh, Thomas, I'm so sorry. We all saw it happen, but we couldn't. There wasn't time to—" "It's not your fault," he assured her, reaching out to pat her hand. "That happened so fast. No one could have predicted it." They're saying it was a rogue orca, Margaret said, wiping her eyes, that it's unusual for them to attack humans, but the way it went after you, it seemed so deliberate. Thomas nodded. It was. That's what's hardest to reconcile. In all my years teaching biology, I emphasized that orcas aren't a threat to humans in the wild. There are virtually no documented fatal attacks. I believed that. I taught that. And now, Margaret asked gently, now I understand something I tried to convey to my students, but never truly grasped myself, that wild animals remain wild no matter how much we study them or think we understand them. That orca wasn't evil or malicious. It was simply being what evolution shaped it to be, a perfect predator. And I was available prey. They talked for a while longer, Margaret sharing her contact information and extracting a promise that Thomas would reach out once he was back in Seattle. Having witnessed his traumatic injury had clearly affected her deeply, and Thomas suspected that maintaining contact would be therapeutic for them both. After Margaret left, Thomas had one more visitor, a serious young woman who introduced herself as Dr. Elín Magnúsdóttir from the Icelandic Marine Research Institute. Mr. Harrington, she began, setting up a small recorder with his permission. I'd like to ask you some questions about your encounter, if you feel up to it. Your observations could be valuable to our understanding of orca behavior. Thomas appreciated her directness and the fact that she referred to the incident as an encounter rather than an accident. For the next hour, he recounted every detail he could remember. The orca's methodical testing of the net, its calculated pursuit, the specifics of each contact. Dr. Magnúsdóttir listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification but never questioning the veracity of his account. When he had finished, she showed him photographs of several orcas known to frequent the waters around Húsavík. This one, Thomas said without hesitation, pointing to an image of a large male with a distinctive notch near the top of its towering dorsal fin. This was the one that attacked me. I remember that notch. We call him a Carey, anchor in English, because of that mark, Dr. Magnúsdóttir confirmed. He's the dominant male of a pod we've been studying for nearly a decade. Typically, they stay farther offshore, but the herring run brought them unusually close to the coast this season. She hesitated, then added, what's remarkable is that a Carey separated from his pod to approach the swimming area. Orcas are highly social animals that rarely hunt alone. This represents a significant deviation from typical behavior. He saw an opportunity, Thomas suggested. The net created an artificial environment that concentrated potential prey, the smaller fish inside, and he found a way to access it. Perhaps, Dr. Magnúsdóttir agreed, though that doesn't explain why he then focused on you specifically, rather than the abundant fish. Movement in the water, Thomas said, recalling his desperate swimming. Splashing, distress. Predators are drawn to it. I was the most visible, the most active target once he breached the net. The marine biologist nodded thoughtfully. Your background in biology gives you a perspective most victims wouldn't have. This incident may help us better understand potential risk factors and improve safety measures for human-orca interactions. Victims, Thomas repeated the word softly. I suppose that's what I am now. A victim, a statistic in your research papers. Dr. Magnúsdóttir's expression softened. You're more than that, Mr. Harrington. You're a survivor, and your willingness to share your experience may help prevent similar incidents in the future. After she left, Thomas lay in the gathering darkness of his hospital room, contemplating the strange turn his life had taken. Somewhere out in the waters off Iceland, a Carey continued his predatory existence, untroubled by the human concept of blame or responsibility. The orca was simply being true to its nature, pursuing survival with the tools and instincts honed by millions of years of evolution. It was a perspective Thomas had always appreciated academically. Now he would have to learn to reconcile it with the very personal cost he had paid for his encounter with the ocean's perfect predator. A week after the attack, Thomas was deemed stable enough to travel. Arrangements were made for his medical transport back to Seattle, where he would begin the long process of physical and psychological rehabilitation. The night before his departure, he was visited by Dr. Jonsdottir for a final assessment. "Your recovery is progressing well, all things considered," she told him as she checked his vital signs. "The surgical site is healing cleanly, and your lung function has improved significantly. You're fortunate to have been in excellent health before the incident." Thomas nodded, though fortunate was not a word he associated with his current situation. "What can I expect when I get home?" he asked. "Realistically," Dr. Jonsdottir considered her words carefully. "Physically, you're looking at several months of rehabilitation. Learning to use a prosthetic limb is challenging but achievable, especially for someone with your determination. Most patients, your age and fitness level, can return to a high degree of mobility and independence." She paused, then added, "The psychological adjustment is often more difficult to predict. Post-traumatic stress is common after such events. You may experience flashbacks, anxiety, sleep disturbances. I've arranged for you to connect with a trauma specialist in Seattle who has experience working with survivors of animal attacks." "I don't know if I qualify as a survivor of an animal attack," Thomas mused. "That makes it sound like I was mauled by a bear in the woods. This was different. I entered the Orca's domain, not the other way around." "That perspective may help you in your psychological recovery," Dr. Jonsdottir observed. "Many survivors struggle with anger toward the animal. Your scientific background gives you a framework for understanding that might ease that particular burden." After she left, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the gravity of his return home began to sink in. His apartment in Seattle had stairs, a challenge he hadn't considered until now. His classroom at Westlake High School was on the second floor. Would the school accommodate his new limitations? Would his students look at him differently? This teacher, who had always been so physically active, now dependent on a prosthetic and possibly a cane. And how would he answer their inevitable questions about the attack? As a biology teacher who had specifically taught marine mammal behavior, the irony of his situation would not be lost on adolescents with their sometimes cruel directness. The journey back to Seattle the next day was exhausting, despite the accommodations made for his condition. A medical transport flight, complete with a nurse to monitor his condition and administer pain medication as needed, delivered him to SeaTac International Airport, where an ambulance waited to transfer him to Swedish Medical Center. Thomas had called ahead to his friend and colleague David Chen, who taught chemistry at Westlake. David had agreed to meet him at the hospital and had already taken care of practical matters, collecting Thomas's mail, caring for his small apartment, and notifying the school administration of the severity of his condition. When Thomas was settled in his hospital room in Seattle, David was his first visitor, bringing with him a potted plant and an awkward mixture of sympathy and forced cheerfulness. "The place looks good," David assured him after the initial greetings and expressions of concern. "I watered your sad collection of houseplants. The snake plant seems determined to outlive us all, but I think the fern is a goner." Thomas appreciated the attempt at normalcy. "Death was always its natural state," he replied with a small smile. "I just prolonged the inevitable." David chuckled, then grew more serious. "The school is in shock. News travels fast, especially something this dramatic. Principal Watkins wants you to know your job is waiting whenever you're ready to return. And the faculty has organized a meal train and a collection for whatever medical expenses insurance doesn't cover." The mention of his workplace brought a wave of longing for the life Thomas had taken for granted just weeks ago. The familiar routine of classes, the energetic chaos of the high school, the sense of purpose that came with teaching young minds, all of it seemed impossibly distant from his current reality of pain medications, medical procedures, and the constant phantom sensation of a limb that was no longer there. "Thanks, David," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Tell everyone I appreciate it. But honestly, I can't even imagine going back right now. I don't know what kind of teacher I can be like this." "The same kind you've always been," David replied firmly. "Smart, engaged, passionate about science. The kids don't care if you're standing or sitting when you explain the difference between mitosis and meiosis." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The truth was, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. His identity had been so bound up in his active, independent lifestyle. He had been the teacher who led the hiking club, who demonstrated insect collection techniques in the field, who would stand for hours helping students with dissection labs. Could he still be that person with one leg? Would the students still respect him, or would they see only his disability? The next few weeks were a blur of medical appointments, physical therapy sessions, and consultations with prosthetists. Thomas learned the complex and often frustrating process of wound care for his residual limb, the exercises that would prepare him for eventually wearing a prosthetic, and the myriad adjustments necessary for even the simplest daily activities. He also began sessions with Dr. Eleanor Wilson, the trauma specialist recommended by his Icelandic doctors. Their first meeting set the tone for what would become a crucial relationship in Thomas's recovery journey. "So," Dr. Wilson said, after they had covered the preliminaries, "you were attacked by an orca while swimming off the coast of Iceland. That's certainly not something I hear every day." Thomas appreciated her directness. "I suppose it makes me something of a statistical anomaly," he replied. "Orca attacks on humans in the wild are virtually non-existent in the scientific record." "And yet, here you are," Dr. Wilson observed. "How does it feel to be that anomaly?" The 60-year question caught Thomas off guard. He had thought about the attack from biological and ecological perspectives, had analyzed the orca's behavior, had contemplated the failures in the safety measures, but he hadn't really considered how it felt to be the person to whom this virtually impossible thing had happened. "Unlucky," he said finally. "Profoundly unlucky, like being struck by lightning on a clear day." "Just bad luck?" Dr. Wilson pressed gently. "No sense of being targeted, singled out?" Thomas considered this. "The orca did single me out from the other swimmers, but that was predatory behavior, not personal malice. I was probably the weakest, the slowest, the one showing the most distress in the water. From a predator's perspective, I was the logical target." "You analyze this very clinically," Dr. Wilson noted. "Is that your way of distancing yourself from the emotional impact?" "Maybe," Thomas admitted. "I'm a science teacher. Looking at things objectively was part of my job." "Was?" Dr. Wilson caught the slip immediately. Thomas sighed. "I don't know if I can go back to teaching. Not like this. Not when everything I taught about orca behavior has been contradicted by my own experience." "Has it, though?" Dr. Wilson asked. "You just explained the attack in terms of predatory behavior and selection of the most vulnerable target. That sounds consistent with what you might teach about any apex predator. But I always emphasize that orcas don't attack humans in the wild," Thomas insisted. "That's what the data said. That's what I believed." "The data said such attacks are extremely rare, not impossible," Dr. Wilson pointed out. "Your experience doesn't invalidate the general pattern. It's an outlier, as you yourself noted." Thomas nodded slowly, seeing the logic in her argument but not yet feeling its emotional truth. "Rationally, I know that, but every time I close my eyes, I see that orca coming toward me. I feel the water displacement as it circles closer. I relive the moment its jaws closed around my leg. How do I reconcile that with the academic understanding I've always taught?" "That," Dr. Wilson said gently, "is precisely what we'll be working on together." As the weeks passed, Thomas made progress both physically and psychologically. He was fitted for a preliminary prosthetic and began the arduous process of learning to walk again. Each small victory, standing unassisted for the first time, taking his first uneven steps with parallel bars, eventually graduating to a cane, was celebrated by his medical team as a significant milestone. But nights remained difficult. Sleep came reluctantly and departed easily, disturbed by vivid dreams of dark water and relentless pursuit. Thomas would often wake in a cold sweat, the phantom pain in his missing leg particularly acute, the memory of the orca's eye, dark, intelligent, implacable, vivid in his mind. During one particularly difficult session with Dr. Wilson, after a night of especially troubling nightmares, Thomas finally articulated the core of his psychological struggle. "I've lost my framework for understanding the world," he said, the realization coming to him even as he spoke the words. "As a scientist, as a teacher, I believed in an ordered universe where things made sense, where patterns were reliable, where knowledge offered some measure of control or at least predictability." Dr. Wilson nodded encouragingly. "But now," Thomas continued, "I've experienced something that shatters that framework. Not just the attack itself, but the randomness of it, the sheer improbability. It makes me question everything I thought I knew, everything I taught my students about the natural world." "That's a profound loss," Dr. Wilson acknowledged, "perhaps even more significant than the physical loss you've suffered." "And I don't know how to rebuild it," Thomas admitted. "How do I teach students about the beauty and order of the natural world when I've experienced its capacity for chaos and destruction so personally?" "Maybe that's exactly what makes you a more valuable teacher now," Dr. Wilson suggested. "You have a perspective few educators can offer, an understanding of both the patterns and the exceptions, the order and the chaos. That's a more complete picture of reality than most people ever grasp." The idea took root in Thomas's mind, growing stronger over the subsequent weeks as he continued his physical rehabilitation. By the time fall arrived, bringing with it the start of a new school year, he had made a decision. He would return to teaching, not immediately, but for the spring semester, giving himself time to become more proficient with his prosthetic and to prepare psychologically for the challenges ahead. Principal Watkins was supportive, arranging for Thomas's classroom to be relocated to the first floor and approving a modified teaching schedule that would allow for rest periods between classes. The science department planned a phased return, with Thomas initially team teaching with a long-term substitute before resuming full responsibilities. As he worked toward this goal, Thomas also began to reconnect with the wider world. He accepted an invitation from Dr. Magnus Dottir to contribute to a paper on orca behavior, sharing his unique perspective as both a biologist and an attack survivor. The process was therapeutic, allowing him to integrate his traumatic experience into his scientific understanding. He also stayed in touch with Margaret, whose own adjustment to the aftermath of witnessing his attack had been difficult. They spoke regularly via video calls, each finding comfort in the other's progress. Margaret had returned to her home in Toronto, but planned to visit Seattle in the spring, a reunion both looked forward to. In late November, nearly 4 months after the attack, Thomas received an unexpected email from Gunnar, the tour guide who had first taken him whale watching in Husavik. Attached was a recent photo taken by another tour boat operator, showing a pod of orcas in Skalfandi Bay. Prominent among them was a large male with a distinctive notch in its dorsal fin, a carry. The sight of the animal that had so irrevocably altered his life sent a cold shiver through Thomas. There was something both terrifying and oddly reassuring about the image, the orca continuing its existence in the cold Icelandic waters, hunting, communicating with its pod, completely unaware of the human drama it had precipitated. Thomas forwarded the image to Dr. Wilson with a brief note, "My attacker continuing his life as nature intended. Strangely, I find I don't hate him." Her reply came quickly. "That's significant progress, Thomas. The ability to see the animal as simply following its nature rather than as a villain in your story is a healthy perspective." And it was true, Thomas realized. Somewhere along the way, the orca had ceased to be a monster in his nightmares and had returned to being what it truly was, a wild predator, magnificent and terrible in its perfect adaptation to its environment. The attack had not been personal. It had been natural, ecological, a rare but not inexplicable intersection of human and wildlife spheres. This realization didn't eliminate his trauma or erase the challenges he faced daily as he adjusted to his new physical reality. But it did offer a framework for understanding, a way to integrate his experience into a coherent worldview that could accommodate both the orderly patterns he had always taught and the chaotic exceptions that sometimes shattered those patterns. As winter settled over Seattle, Thomas continued his preparations for returning to the classroom. He created new lesson plans that incorporated his experience, developed presentations that used his encounter as a case study in predator behavior, and practice the inevitably difficult conversation he would have with his students about his changed appearance and mobility. The first snowfall of December found him standing at the window of his apartment, watching the flakes drift past the glass, his weight balanced between his prosthetic leg and the cane he still used for stability. In the twilight, the snow-covered landscape took on a blue-white hue, reminiscent of the Icelandic waters that had changed his life. Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest that often preceded a flashback, but this time he didn't fight it. Instead, he let the memory come, but held it at a distance, observing it rather than reliving it. He saw himself in the water, saw the orca's approach, felt again the terrifying moment of impact. But now, alongside the fear and pain, there was something else, a sense of wonder at having encountered such a creature in its element, at having witnessed the full spectrum of nature's capacity for both beauty and brutality. As the memory subsided, Thomas realized he was still standing, still breathing calmly. The flashback hadn't overwhelmed him as it once would have. Progress, small but significant, a step toward whatever his new normal would eventually become. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the familiar landscape into something new and strange, but not without its own beauty. Much like the transformation Thomas himself was undergoing, painful, challenging, irreversible, but not without the possibility of finding new meaning, new purpose, even new joy in the life that remained to him. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, Orca the orca continued his predatory existence, a perfect expression of evolution's blind craftsmanship. And here in Seattle, Thomas Harrington, biology teacher and survivor, continued his own adaptation to a changed environment, each of them following the fundamental imperative of all living things: to persist, to adapt, to find a way forward through whatever challenges the world presented. It was, Thomas thought as he turned from the window, a profound lesson in biology, more visceral and immediate than any he had ever taught in his classroom. And in the spring, he would share it with his students, offering them a glimpse of the natural world in all its complex, terrifying, magnificent reality, not as an abstract concept in a textbook, but as a lived experience that had rewritten his understanding of what it meant to be a living creature in a wild and unpredictable universe. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be difficult days, painful reminders, moments of darkness when the memory of cold water and relentless pursuit threatened to overwhelm him. But Thomas had survived the worst that nature could inflict. He had faced the ocean's perfect predator and emerged, changed but still alive, still capable of finding meaning in the experience. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all, one he would carry with him into his classroom and into whatever future awaited him beyond the long shadow cast by that fateful day in the waters off Iceland, when he had come face to face with the wild heart of nature and somehow found the strength to carry on. The next morning, Thomas woke to a transformed world. Snow had fallen heavily through the night, blanketing Seattle in a pristine white coat that muffled sounds and softened edges. From his bed, he could see the snow-laden branches of the Douglas, furred outside his window, bowed under their winter burden but unbroken. The sight brought an unexpected parallel to mind: his own life, bent but not broken by the weight of trauma and loss. The analogy might have seemed trite before his encounter with Orca, but now Thomas found himself increasingly drawn to these connections between his experience and the natural world he had spent his career studying. He reached for his phone on the nightstand and saw a notification, an email from Dr. Magnus Dottir in Iceland. Opening it with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation, he found another update on Orca's pod. "Thought you might be interested," she wrote. "We've observed some unusual behavior from Orca recently. He's spending more time separated from his pod, patrolling coastal areas rather than hunting in the deeper waters where the herring are most abundant. This is atypical for orcas, which are highly social and rarely deviate from established hunting patterns without clear environmental causes." Thomas read the message twice, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Was the orca's behavior truly changed by their encounter? It seemed unlikely. Anthropomorphizing was a trap even experienced biologists sometimes fell into, and yet the timing was suggestive. Something had altered in Akari's behavioral patterns following the attack. He composed a careful reply, asking for more data, more observations. His scientific mind, dormant for too long during his physical recovery, sparked to life with questions and hypotheses. Perhaps this could be another way to process his experience, through collaborative research, through the familiar framework of scientific inquiry. After sending the email, Thomas faced the morning's first major challenge, showering and dressing with his prosthetic. The routine had grown more familiar over the past months, but remained time-consuming and occasionally frustrating. Today, however, he moved through it with a renewed sense of purpose. The email from Iceland had reminded him that there was still work to be done, still contributions he could make to his field despite, or perhaps because of, what had happened to him. Once dressed, he made his way to the kitchen, moving carefully on the prosthetic that was still not entirely comfortable after extended periods of sitting. Coffee brewing, Thomas opened his laptop and navigated to the syllabus he'd been developing for his return to teaching. The document reflected his evolving perspective on biology education. Where once he had presented the natural world as primarily a place of order and predictable patterns, his revised curriculum acknowledged the role of chaos, of outlier events, of statistical improbabilities that occasionally reshaped both individual lives and entire ecosystems. His phone chimed with a text from David, checking if Thomas needed anything given the snowfall. The message included a photo of Westlake High's campus transformed by snow, with students engaged in an impromptu snowball fight in the quad. The Heisentor image triggered a pang of longing for the rhythms of school life that had defined his existence for so many years. But it was no longer nostalgia tinged with despair. It was anticipation. In just over a month, he would be back in that environment, changed, but still fundamentally a teacher, still capable of connecting students to the wonders and complexities of the living world. Thomas replied to David with thanks and a question about the progress of the classroom relocation. Then, coffee in hand, he moved to the small desk in his living room, where he had set up a workstation. Today's task was to review the latest research on orca communication patterns, part of his preparation for a unit on marine mammal intelligence that would inevitably lead to discussions of his own encounter. As he worked, occasionally pausing to massage his residual limb when phantom pain flared up, Thomas felt more like himself than he had since the attack. The familiar immersion in scientific literature, the process of extracting relevant information for eventual translation to his students, these activities reconnected him to his pre-injury identity in ways that were profoundly comforting. Around noon, a notification appeared on his laptop, a reminder for his weekly video session with Dr. Wilson. Thomas saved his research notes and opened the video conference application. When the therapist's face appeared on screen, she immediately noticed the change in his demeanor. "You look energized today," she observed. "Something good happened." Thomas shared the email from Dr. Magnus Dottir and his subsequent deep dive into research. "It feels like reclaiming a part of myself," he explained, "using my experience not just as a trauma to overcome, but as a unique data point, a perspective that might actually contribute something valuable to the field." "That's a powerful reframing," Dr. Wilson nodded approvingly. "Turning victimhood into expertise. Have you had any flashbacks or nightmares since we last spoke?" "One flashback yesterday watching the snow," Thomas admitted. "But it was different this time. I could observe the memory without being completely overwhelmed by it, almost like watching footage of someone else's experience, even though I knew it was mine." "That's significant progress," Dr. Wilson said. "It suggests you're developing the ability to process the traumatic memory without being re-traumatized by it. How about the phantom pain?" "Still there, especially in the mornings or when I'm tired. But I'm getting better at managing it with the techniques you suggested." They continued to discuss Thomas's preparations for returning to teaching, with Dr. Wilson offering strategies for handling potential triggers in the classroom environment, questions from students standing for long periods, navigating crowded hallways with his prosthetic and cane. "I'm concerned about the first time a student asks directly about the attack," Thomas confessed. "I want to be honest without traumatizing them, informative without centering myself as some kind of survivor hero." "Practice your response ahead of time," Dr. Wilson suggested. Have a concise, age-appropriate explanation ready. And remember, it's okay to set boundaries about how detailed you're willing to be. After the session ended, Thomas returned to his research, but his mind kept circling back to the question of how to discuss his experience with his students. Eventually, he opened a new document and began to type out potential responses, refining them for clarity and emotional balance. By late afternoon, snow was falling again, large flakes drifting past his window in the fading winter light. Thomas set aside his work and made his way to the small balcony off his living room. Bundled against the cold, he stood watching the snow accumulate on the railing, on the branches of nearby trees, on the cars parked along the street below. The world was quieter under snow, the usual urban sounds muffled by the insulating blanket of white. In that relative silence, Thomas found his thoughts drifting back to the waters of Husavik, the clarity of the sea, the distant volcanic mountains, the deceptive tranquility of the surface that hid the powerful currents beneath. He remembered the moment before the attack, when he had first seen Akeri testing the net, the mixture of fear and awe he had felt witnessing such a magnificent predator up close. That feeling hadn't been entirely extinguished by what followed. Even now, knowing the damage those powerful jaws had inflicted, Thomas couldn't deny the biological marvel that was the orca, a perfect evolutionary success story, a creature exquisitely adapted to its role in the marine ecosystem. As darkness fell, Thomas returned inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. He prepared a simple dinner and ate at his desk, reviewing his notes from the day. His phone chimed with another email notification, Dr. Magnus Dottir responding to his questions about Akeri's behavior. "We can't definitively link the behavioral changes to your encounter," she wrote, "but the timing is certainly suggestive. We know that orcas are capable of learning from novel experiences and adjusting their behavior accordingly. It's possible that the success of the attack, despite the unusual circumstances and unexpected prey type, has led Akeri to explore similar environments more frequently." The idea was both unsettling and fascinating from a scientific perspective. Had his trauma contributed to a behavioral evolution in the orca, potentially increasing the risk for other humans? Or was this simply an unrelated change, coincidental in timing? Thomas drafted another reply, suggesting potential research questions and methodologies. The exchange was invigorating, a return to the intellectual engagement that had been such an important part of his identity before the attack. As he prepared for bed that night, removing his prosthetic and performing the necessary care for his residual limb, Thomas reflected on the day's subtle but significant shift in his outlook. For the first time since returning to Seattle, he had spent most of a day focused on the future rather than dwelling on the past, engaged with his field rather than isolated in his recovery. It wasn't a complete transformation. The phantom pain still flared as he settled into bed, and he knew the flashbacks might return in his dreams. The physical challenges of his new reality remained, as did the psychological adjustments still to be navigated. But something had changed. A corner turned in his long journey toward whatever new version of himself would emerge from the crucible of his encounter with Akeri. As he drifted toward sleep, Thomas found himself thinking not of the attack but of the classroom that awaited him, of young minds eager to learn about the living world in all its complexity, its beauty, its occasional harshness. He would return, to them not diminished but deepened by his experience, with a perspective few biology teachers could offer, and a newfound appreciation for both the patterns and the chaos that defined life on Earth. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Seattle, transformation coming silently, inexorably, one crystalline flake at a time. The weeks leading up to Thomas's return to teaching passed with increasing momentum. January brought the final fitting of his permanent prosthetic, a significant improvement over the preliminary model he'd been using. The new limb was lighter, more responsive, and custom designed for his specific needs and activity level. His prosthetist, a forthright woman named Carla with 20 years of experience, watched critically as Thomas walked the length of her office, making minute adjustments to the fit and alignment. "You're still favoring your left side," she observed. "Try to distribute your weight more evenly." Remember, this isn't a crutch or a replacement. It's a tool that works with your body. Thomas concentrated on his gait, focusing on the biofeedback techniques he'd learned in physical therapy. Gradually, his movement became more natural, less hesitant. Better, Carla approved. You'll need to build more confidence before you're ready to abandon the cane entirely, but that will come with time and practice. Will I ever be able to walk without thinking about it? Thomas asked, the question reflecting one of his deeper concerns about returning to the classroom. Teaching requires my full attention on the students, the material. I can't be constantly monitoring my stride. Absolutely, Carla assured him. The brain is remarkably adaptable. Eventually, walking with your prosthetic will become as automatic as walking was before. But it takes repetition, consistency, and patience. Patience had become Thomas's watchword over the past months. Patience with his healing body, with the learning curve of prosthetic use, with the unpredictable surges of phantom pain and psychological triggers that still occasionally disrupted his days and nights. But January also brought tangible signs of progress beyond the physical realm. Principal Watkins invited Thomas to visit his newly relocated classroom, now situated in what had once been a science lab on the first floor of Westlake High. The room had been modified with wider aisles to accommodate his current mobility needs and equipped with a high stool that would allow him to teach while seated when necessary. The students have been asking about you, Watkins told him as they toured the space. Particularly your AP biology class. They're excited to have you back. The comment warmed Thomas more than he expected. In his darkest moments during early recovery, he had wondered if his students would see him differently after the injury, as diminished somehow, less authoritative, an object of pity rather than respect. Knowing they were anticipating his return was deeply reassuring. We've also been discussing how to incorporate your experience into our marine biology curriculum, Watkins continued. If you're comfortable with that, of course, the science department feels it represents a unique educational opportunity. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. I've been working on exactly that, not sensationalizing what happened, but using it as a case study in predator behavior, marine ecosystem management, human-wildlife interaction. There are valuable lessons to be extracted from it. That's the Thomas Harrington approach I remember, Watkins smiled, finding the teachable moment in everything, even personal tragedy. As January drew to a close, Thomas made a decision that both terrified and energized him. He contacted Dr. Magnusdóttir in Iceland with a proposal. He would return to Húsavík in the summer, not as a tourist this time, but as a visiting researcher, to contribute directly to her team's ongoing study of Orca and his pod. Are you certain you're ready for that, Doctor? Wilson asked when he shared the plan during their therapy session. Returning to the site of your trauma is a significant step. I don't think I'll ever be completely ready, Thomas admitted, but it feels necessary somehow, not just for my recovery, but for my understanding as a biologist. And yes, there's an element of confronting the fear, of refusing to let it define my relationship with the ocean permanently. Dr. Wilson considered this. It could be powerful, provided you're prepared for the emotional response revisiting the location might trigger. What does your medical team say about the physical aspects of such a trip? My surgeon says I should be cleared for international travel by then. My PT and prosthetist are designing a specialized maintenance and exercise regimen to prepare me. I won't be swimming, obviously, but I want to be able to participate fully in the research activities on the boats. The plan gave Thomas's recovery a new dimension. No longer was he simply working to return to his previous life as a teacher, but actively shaping a future that integrated his traumatic experience into his professional identity in a constructive way. This forward momentum carried him through the final days of preparation for his return to the classroom. He practiced his lessons, refined his explanations of complex biological concepts, and prepared materials that would help students understand the remarkable adaptations of marine mammals, including those that had nearly cost him his life. The night before his first day back at Westlake, Thomas received an unexpected package. The return address indicated it was from Margaret in Toronto. Inside was a small, exquisitely carved wooden orca, along with a note. Thomas, When I saw this in a gallery, I thought of you. Not because it reminds me of that terrible day, but because it represents what you've taught me about respecting the wild on its own terms. Looking forward to seeing you in the spring. Margaret. The gesture brought unexpected tears to Thomas's eyes. He placed the carving on his desk where he would see it daily, not as a reminder of trauma, but as a symbol of the perspective he had gained through his experience. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a perfect Seattle winter day. Thomas E. woke earlier than necessary, his body thrumming with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. He moved through his morning routine with deliberate care, particularly attentive to the fitting of his prosthetic and the choice of clothing that would accommodate it comfortably while presenting the professional appearance he wanted for his return. David had offered to pick him up, but Thomas had declined, preferring to drive himself, another reclamation of independence that felt significant. As he navigated the familiar route to Westlake High, he found himself rehearsing potential responses to the inevitable questions, mentally preparing for the curious stares, the awkward pauses that might greet his altered appearance. The school parking lot was already filling with students when he arrived. Thomas selected a spot in the recently designated accessible section near the main entrance, another accommodation he was still adjusting to psychologically, though he recognized its practical necessity. As he gathered his materials and prepared to exit the car, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back at him was older than the one that had departed for Iceland last summer, lined now with experiences that had left their marks in ways beyond the physical. But the eyes were clear, focused, present in a way they hadn't been during the fog of early recovery. Thomas took a deep breath, opened the car door, and stepped out into his new life, one foot flesh and bone, the other carbon fiber and microprocessors, both carrying him forward into whatever awaited beyond the long shadow of that fateful day in the waters off Iceland, when he had encountered the ocean's perfect predator and somehow found the strength to carry on. The weight of his journey seemed distilled into this moment, standing in the school parking lot, materials clutched in one hand, cane in the other, poised between his past and future selves. Then, squaring his shoulders, Thomas Harrington walked toward the building where he had taught for 3 decades, ready to share with his students not just what he knew about the living world, but what he had learned about surviving in it. And somewhere in the distant North Atlantic, Orca the Orca continued his predatory existence, hunting, communicating, adapting, a powerful reminder of nature's capacity for both wonder and terror, beauty and brutality, all bound together in the complex web of life that Thomas had dedicated his career to understanding, and now, through his own remarkable story, to teaching anew. The morning fog rolled in thick over the Strait of Magellan, obscuring the distant shoreline and transforming the world into a palette of grays. Mateo Alvarez adjusted the straps of his life vest and gazed out at the water, calculating the tide and current as he had done hundreds of times before. At 25, he was already considered one of the most experienced kayakers in Puerto Natales, having grown up navigating these waters since he was barely tall enough to hold a paddle. Conditions are perfect, he said to himself, his breath forming small clouds in the chilly autumn air. The water temperature here never truly warmed, not even in summer, but March brought a particular crispness that invigorated him. The forecast promised calm seas for the first half of the day, ideal for his planned route along the western coast of the strait. Mateo ran his hand along the smooth fiberglass hull of his kayak, a sleek red vessel he had saved for over 2 years to purchase. Most tourists who came to paddle these waters rented equipment, but for locals like him who treated the strait as an extension of themselves, owning your craft was a matter of pride. "Going far today?" called a voice from behind him. Mateo turned to see Carlos, an older fisherman who had known him since childhood, approaching along the small dock. "Just to Isla Contramaestre and back," Mateo replied, securing his waterproof pack containing emergency supplies, a first aid kit, a marine, radio and enough food and water for the day. "Should be back by late afternoon." Carlos nodded, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Saw some orcas yesterday near the southern passage, a pod of maybe 6 or 7. "That's good luck," Matteo replied with a smile. "I've only seen them a handful of times from the kayak. Usually they're not interested in small vessels like mine." "True enough," Carlos conceded. "Still, they've been acting strange lately. Manuel said one bumped his fishing boat last week. Might be worth staying closer to shore." Matteo nodded respectfully but inwardly dismissed the warning. Orcas were apex predators, yes, but attacks on humans were virtually non-existent in recorded history. Like most locals, he had grown up with a reverence for these intelligent creatures that traveled the cold southern waters. They were cautious around boats, especially the fishing vessels that sometimes competed for the same prey. "I'll keep my eyes open," he promised, slipping his hands into neoprene gloves. His wetsuit would protect him from the frigid water temperatures, but hypothermia was always a risk in these waters, even on calm days. Matteo pushed off from the dock with practiced ease, feeling the familiar sensation of the kayak stabilizing beneath him as he began to paddle. The rhythm came naturally after so many years, his body finding the most efficient motion without conscious thought. The shoreline of Puerto Natales gradually receded behind him as he cut through the still morning water. The fog would burn off by mid-morning, according to the weather report, but for now it created a dreamlike quality to his surroundings. Sound traveled strangely through the mist, muffled yet somehow more immediate. The soft splash of his paddle entering the water seemed to echo, while the calls of gulls overhead became distant and ethereal. Matteo checked his waterproof watch. It was just after 7 in the morning, and he had roughly 2 hours of paddling ahead of him to reach his destination. He followed the coastline, keeping it within sight, but maintaining enough distance to avoid the rocky shallows. The strait was famous for its unpredictable currents, but years of experience had taught him how to read the water, to feel the subtlest changes in movement beneath his kayak. An hour into his journey, the fog began to lift as predicted, revealing the impressive landscape that made this region a magnet for tourists and nature enthusiasts. Rugged mountains rose dramatically on both sides of the strait, their peaks still dusted with snow, even as autumn settled over Patagonia. In the distance, massive glaciers reflected the strengthening sunlight, their blue-white surfaces a reminder of the region's proximity to Antarctica. Matteo paused his paddling to take a drink of water from the tube connected to his hydration pack. The physical exertion and the natural beauty surrounding him created a sense of profound contentment. This was why he came out here whenever he could, slipping away from his job as a tour guide to reconnect with the environment that had shaped him. As he resumed paddling, something caught his attention in the water ahead. A disturbance in the surface, a momentary flicker of movement that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Matteo slowed his pace, scanning the area with narrowed eyes. It could have been a sea lion or perhaps a dolphin, both common enough in these waters. He was about to continue when he saw it again, this time unmistakable. A tall black dorsal fin cutting through the water about 50 meters ahead of him, moving parallel to his course. Matteo's heart quickened with excitement rather than fear. An orca sighting was always special, something even locals never took for granted. The fin disappeared beneath the surface and Matteo waited, his paddle resting across the kayak. Experience told him that where there was one orca, there would likely be others. He grabbed his waterproof camera from its secure pocket, hoping to capture images of the encounter. Minutes passed with no further sightings, and Matteo began to wonder if the orca had moved on. He was just about to put his camera away when the water to his right erupted in a powerful surge, and a massive black and white form breached the surface completely, rising at least 4 meters into the air before crashing back down in an explosion of spray that rocked his kayak. "Incredible," Matteo whispered, quickly raising his camera to capture the moment. The orca surfaced again, closer this time, revealing the distinctive white patches above its eyes that gave these creatures their common Spanish name, Balena asesina, killer whale. Matteo estimated it was a male, judging by the size and height of the dorsal fin, nearly 2 meters tall, straight and imposing. Adult male orcas could reach lengths of 9 meters and weigh up to 6 tons, making them formidable hunters in any environment. This one appeared to be a mature adult, its black, skin glistening in the morning light. The orca circled his kayak, maintaining a distance of about 20 meters. Matteo remained still, not wanting to appear threatening or provoke the animal. Despite their fearsome reputation, killer whales had never been known to attack humans in the wild deliberately. Their intelligence and curiosity, however, were well documented. "Just checking me out, aren't you?" Matteo said softly, watching as the orca made another closer pass. Something about this encounter felt different from previous sightings. Usually orcas passed by with minimal interest in small vessels like kayaks, focused on hunting or traveling to new feeding grounds. This one seemed deliberately investigative, circling with what appeared to be purpose. Matteo scanned the surrounding, water for signs of the rest of the pod Carlos had mentioned, but no other fins were visible. Could this be a solitary male? While uncommon, some adult males did occasionally separate from their family groups temporarily. The orca disappeared again, and this time the silence stretched longer. Matteo kept his body relaxed, but remained vigilant, aware that the animal was still nearby, even if not visible. The water was deep here, dropping off quickly from the coastal shelf, providing ample space for the massive predator to maneuver below. He was contemplating whether to continue his journey or head back to report the sighting when the attack came, sudden and without warning. The orca surfaced directly alongside his kayak, so close that water cascaded over the cockpit, and then deliberately nudged the vessel with its head. The impact was controlled, but powerful enough to tilt the kayak precariously to one side. Matteo's years of experience kicked in automatically as he braced with his paddle, preventing a capsize by distributing his weight in the opposite direction. His heart hammered against his ribs, adrenaline flooding his system. "Easy," he said aloud, his voice tight with tension. "Easy there." The orca submerged again, but remained visible just below the surface, its white patches ghostly beneath the water. It circled once, twice, and then approached from the stern, this time rising partially out of the water to bump the back of the kayak more forcefully. Matteo's throat went dry. This behavior was unusual, deliberate and targeted rather, than merely curious. He knew from his training as a guide that wildlife encounters required respect for the animal's space. The best course of action now would be to remove himself from the situation, to paddle calmly but quickly toward the shore. He dipped his paddle into the water and began to move toward the coastline, keeping his movements smooth and consistent. The shore was still at least half a kilometer away, not an impossible distance but not immediate safety either. The orca followed, pacing the kayak effortlessly, sometimes disappearing from view only to reappear alarmingly close. Matteo's mind raced through what he knew about orca behavior. They were known to play with their food, to practice hunting techniques on non-prey items. Could the orca be treating his kayak as some kind of novel toy? The thought was both fascinating and terrifying. The third impact came from below, a powerful, upward thrust that lifted the kayak partially out of the water. Matteo gasped as he fought to maintain his balance, his paddle slicing through air instead of water momentarily, before the kayak crashed back down. "This is not good," he muttered, increasing his paddling speed. The shore seemed impossibly distant now, the current subtly working against him as he tried to make progress. He could see his destination, Isla Contramaestre, to his left, but it was even further than the mainland shore. The orca breached again, this time landing so close to the kayak that the resulting wave nearly capsized it. Matteo struggled to right himself, his breath coming in short gasps as he realized the situation was escalating. He needed help. With one hand steadying his paddle across the cockpit, he reached for the marine radio secured in a waterproof case on his deck. He needed to alert the Coast Guard, to request assistance before... The impact from below came with such force that it launched the kayak completely out of the water. For a suspended moment, Matteo felt weightless, his body separated from the seat as the vessel was propelled upward. Then gravity reclaimed them both, and he crashed back down but not into his secure position. The kayak landed on its side, and despite his desperate attempt to brace, Matteo found himself plunged into the frigid waters of the strait. The shock of cold stole his breath, despite the protection of his wetsuit. He surfaced quickly, gasping, one hand still clutching his paddle by instinct. His kayak floated upside down a few meters away, but his immediate concern was the location of the orca. The massive predator surfaced 10 meters away, its dorsal fin cutting through the water as it turned to face him directly. Matteo had never felt so vulnerable, so completely at the mercy of a wild creature. His training kicked in. He needed to get back to his kayak, to use it as a barrier and potential flotation device. He began to swim toward the overturned vessel, keeping his movements calm despite the panic threatening to overwhelm him. The water temperature was dangerously cold, perhaps 8 degrees Celsius, meaning he had limited time before hypothermia became a serious concern. The orca watched, seemingly assessing his movements, then disappeared beneath the surface. Matteo reached his kayak and clung to the hull, quickly finding the grab handles on the bottom, now the top, of the overturned craft. Years of practice in recovery techniques guided his actions. He would need to right the kayak, empty it of water using the bilge pump secured inside, and somehow climb back in, all while dealing with a curious and potentially aggressive orca. Before he could begin the procedure, a powerful force grabbed his leg. The sensation was like nothing he had ever experienced, not painful at first, but completely overwhelming. He was pulled beneath the surface so suddenly that he barely had time to take a breath. Underwater, the world transformed into a blur of bubbles and muted light. Matteo felt the incredible pressure of the orca's mouth around his right leg, not biting down fully, but holding him with enough force to control his movement. The realization struck him with horrifying clarity. The orca was treating him exactly as it would a seal or sea lion, incapacitating its prey before determining whether it was suitable food. Matteo's lungs burned as he struggled not to inhale water. The orca pulled him deeper, perhaps 5 meters below the surface, then released him suddenly. Disoriented, Matteo kicked frantically toward what he hoped was the surface, his vision beginning to darken at the edges from lack of oxygen. He broke the surface with a desperate gasp, coughing and sputtering as his lungs expelled water he had inadvertently inhaled. His kayak was now several meters away, and he could see the marine radio had become dislodged from its case and was floating separately, out of reach. "Help!" he shouted, though he knew there was likely no one close enough to hear. The shore remained distressingly far away. His right leg throbbed with a dull pain that was quickly intensifying as the initial shock wore off. Looking down, he saw that his wetsuit was torn and blood was seeping into the water. His blood. The sight sent a new wave of panic through him. Blood in the water could trigger a predatory response, turning an investigative encounter into something far more dangerous. Matteo began to swim toward shore with powerful strokes, using his paddle as an impromptu kickboard. His leg was functioning but growing more painful by the second. He had covered perhaps 20 meters when the orca returned, circling him with disturbing precision. Matteo stopped swimming and tried to control his breathing, to think rationally, despite the terror clouding his mind. The orca approached slowly this time, its massive head rising partially out of the water as it studied him. Matteo raised his paddle defensively, though he knew it would offer little protection against an animal that routinely took down seals and sea lions with ease. The orca circled again, then dove. The seconds of not knowing its location were perhaps worse than seeing it approach. The next attack came from directly below, the orca rocketing upward with such speed that Matteo had no time to react. Sant's head struck his torso, sending him flying through the air before crashing back into the water. The impact knocked the air from his lungs and separated him from his paddle, leaving him gasping and disoriented as he struggled to stay afloat. Through the pain and confusion, a strange clarity came to Matteo. The orca was not treating him as prey to be eaten. It was displaying the same behaviors documented in orcas hunting for sport or practice. The calculated strikes, the controlled pressure of its bite, the periods of observation between attacks. This was a predator testing its skills against an unfamiliar target. As if confirming this assessment, the orca surfaced nearby, watching, him with an eye that seemed to evaluate his response. The intelligence behind that gaze was unmistakable, and somehow that made the situation even more terrifying. This wasn't mindless aggression. It was deliberate, calculated. Matteo floated, on his back, trying to conserve energy while keeping his eyes on the predator. His right leg was now sending sharp spikes of pain through his body, and he could feel the coldness of the water beginning to affect his thinking. He needed to get to shore soon, or hypothermia would claim him even if the orca lost interest. With Doe paddle and his kayak now drifting further away, Matteo had little choice but to swim. He oriented himself toward the closest point of land and began a modified side stroke, keeping his injured leg relatively still while propelling himself with his arms and left leg. The orca followed, sometimes disappearing for minutes at a time before reappearing with unsettling suddenness. Each time it vanished, Matteo found himself tensing, anticipating the next attack from below or behind. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes of swimming, he heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, the distant rumble of a boat engine. He paused, treading water as he scanned the horizon. There, perhaps half a kilometer away, a fishing boat was making its way along the coast. "Here!" he shouted, waving his arms frantically above his head. "Help! Over!" "Here!" The boat continued on its course, apparently too far to hear his cries. Desperation lent strength to Matteo's voice as he shouted again and again, fighting to be heard over the water and distance. The orca chose this moment to return, surfacing between Matteo and the distant boat, as if understanding the threat to its game. It circled closer, its movements becoming more agitated as Matteo continued to shout and wave. Then, miraculously, the fishing boat altered its course, turning in his direction. Someone had spotted him. Relief flooded through Matteo, quickly tempered by the knowledge that he still had to survive long enough for rescue to arrive. The orca seemed to sense the change in the situation as well. It approached more aggressively now, its passes becoming closer and faster. Matteo tried to keep his body as compact as possible, drawing his injured leg up to protect it from further attack. When the next strike came, it targeted his left side, the orca's body slamming into him with calculated force. Matteo was pushed underwater, disoriented by the impact and the stinging salt water in his eyes. He fought his way back to the surface, coughing and struggling to keep his head above water. As his strength began to wane, the boat was closer now, perhaps 200 meters away. He could see figures on deck pointing in his direction, could hear the engine revving as the captain increased speed. "Hurry!" he gasped, though they couldn't possibly hear him. The orca circled once more, then dove deep. Matteo knew what was coming, another attack from below, potentially more damaging than the previous ones. He tried to prepare himself, to position his body to absorb the impact, but there was little he could do in the open water. The strike never came. Instead, the massive predator surfaced about 30 meters away, its dorsal fin cutting through the water as it watched the approaching boat. After a moment's observation, it slipped beneath the surface and disappeared, heading away from both Matteo and the vessel. The relief was almost overwhelming, but Matteo knew he wasn't safe yet. The cold was affecting him more severely now, his movements becoming sluggish and his thoughts confused. He focused on keeping his face above water, on taking regular breaths as the fishing boat closed the final distance. Voices called to him. In Spanish, hands reached down from the side of the boat. Matteo's fingers were too numb to grip properly, but strong arms hooked under his and hauled him from the water, his body feeling impossibly heavy as it cleared the surface. He collapsed onto the deck, shivering violently as the cold air hit his wet body. Someone was wrapping him in blankets. Another was examining his injured leg, speaking rapidly into a radio, calling for medical assistance, he realized distantly. "The orca," Matteo managed to say through chattering teeth. "It attacked me." "We saw," one of the fishermen replied, his weathered face grave. "Never seen anything like it in 30 years on these waters." "My kayak. It's gone, son. But you're alive, and that's what matters." Matteo nodded weakly, allowing himself to be moved into the small cabin where it was marginally warmer. The pain in his leg was becoming more pronounced as the adrenaline ebbed, and he could see through the torn wetsuit that the damage was significant. Deep puncture wounds where the orca's teeth had gripped him, and extensive bruising from the Impact. The boat turned toward Puerto Natales, its engine pushed to maximum speed. One of the crew, a man Mateo vaguely recognized from the harbor, pressed a steaming cup of tea into his hands. "Drink," he instructed, "for the cold." Mateo sipped the sweet liquid gratefully, feeling its warmth spread through his core. His mind replayed the attack in fragmented flashes, the initial bump, the capsizing, the terrifying moment of being dragged underwater. He had come face to face with one of the ocean's most perfect predators and somehow survived. As the fishing boat neared the harbor, Mateo gazed out at the strait that had been his playground and passion for as long as he could remember. Somewhere, out there, the Orca continued its journey, perhaps rejoining its pod, perhaps moving on to new hunting grounds. For it, the encounter had been little more than a moment of curiosity or practice. For Mateo, it had changed everything. The harbor came into view, and he could see an ambulance waiting at the dock, its lights flashing. Word traveled fast in a small community like Puerto Natales. As the boat maneuvered toward the pier, Mateo closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by a complex mix of emotions: gratitude for his rescue, fear of the damage to his leg, and an unsettling realization that the waters he had always considered home now held a new and terrible knowledge. The medical team worked efficiently, transferring Mateo from the fishing boat to a stretcher and then into the ambulance. The local hospital was small but accustomed to treating injuries from the fishing industry and adventure tourism. Within an hour of his arrival, Mateo found himself in a treatment room, his wetsuit cut away completely, an IV delivering fluids and pain medication to his system. "You're very lucky," the doctor told him after examining the wounds on his leg. "The bites are deep but clean and no major arteries were damaged. There's significant muscle trauma, however, and we'll need to monitor for infection. Marine bacteria can be particularly problematic." Mateo nodded, wincing as the doctor continued, "Cleaning the wounds. Will I be able to kayak again?" The doctor hesitated. "Eventually, yes, with proper rehabilitation. But it will take time, and you'll have permanent scarring." Time was something Mateo now had a newfound appreciation for. As the doctor worked, his mind kept returning to the moments underwater, to the feeling of complete helplessness as the Orca held him in its jaws. How close had he come to death? How fine was the line between the predator's curiosity and its killing instinct? News of the attack spread quickly through Puerto Natales and beyond. By the following day, as Mateo recovered, in his hospital bed, reporters from regional and even national media outlets were requesting interviews. The event was unprecedented in the region. While orcas were common in the Strait of Magellan, attacks on humans were virtually unheard of worldwide. Carlos was among his first visitors, the old fisherman's face drawn with concern and a hint of guilt. "I warned you about those orcas acting strange," he said, taking a seat beside the bed. "Never thought something like this would happen, though." "It wasn't your fault," Mateo assured him. "I've paddled past orcas a dozen times before without incident. They're saying it was a male, a big one, solitary." Mateo nodded. "I only saw the one. Is there any news about it?" "Some fishing boats spotted what might be the same orca yesterday, further south in the strait. The authorities are telling people to stay out of the water for now, especially in small craft." The thought of others potentially facing what he had experienced sent a chill through Mateo. It was so deliberate, Carlos. The way it attacked, it knew exactly what it was doing. Carlos was silent for a moment. The old Coesca people who lived in these waters for thousands of years had many stories about orcas. They believed some carried the spirits of their ancestors, while others were filled with malevolence. They respected them, feared them. "I always thought those were just stories," Mateo said quietly. "Most are," Carlos agreed. "But every story has its seed in truth. These are intelligent creatures with complex behaviors we still don't fully understand." After Carlos left, Mateo drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams filled with black water and the sensation of being pulled downward. He would wake with a start, his heart racing, convinced for a moment that he was still in the strait with the orca circling below. On to. The third day after the attack, a marine biologist named Dr. Elena Morales arrived from Punta Arenas. She had been studying the local orca populations for over a decade and had requested to interview Mateo about his experience. "Your account is incredibly valuable," she explained, setting up a small recorder after receiving his permission. There are fewer than 10 documented cases of wild orcas attacking humans worldwide, and none with the level of detail you can provide as a survivor who is also knowledgeable about marine life. Mateo recounted the event as precisely as he could, describing the orca's size and markings, its behavior before and during the attack, the apparent calculation in its movements. Dr. Morales listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly allowing him to speak uninterrupted. "Based on your description, I believe I know this individual," she said when he had finished. "We call him M47, but the local fisherman named him Solitario years ago. He's approximately 20 years old and has been observed periodically separating from his pod for extended periods. Is that normal behavior?" "Not typical, but not unheard of either, especially for mature males. What's particularly interesting is that M47 has been documented showing unusual interest in boats before, though never with this level of aggression." "So, why attack me?" Mateo asked, the question that had been haunting him since that morning. Dr. Morales considered this carefully. Orcas are apex predators with complex social structures and behaviors. They're known to engage in what we might call play with potential prey or objects of interest. Your kayak, small, red, moving in a manner different from most boats, might have triggered a predatory or investigative response. "But it wasn't just investigating," Mateo insisted. "It deliberately capsized me, dragged me underwater." "Yes, and that's what makes this case so significant. The behavior you describe shows elements of a practice hunt, similar to how orcas will play with seals before killing them, or how they teach hunting techniques to younger pod members." The thought sent a shiver through Mateo. "So I was a training exercise? Possibly, or perhaps it was simply curious about an unfamiliar object that then exhibited interesting behavior. You, when separated from the kayak. Orcas are highly intelligent and can become bored. Some researchers believe they seek novel experiences and challenges. That's not very comforting." Dr. Morales smiled sympathetically. "No, I suppose not, but understanding the behavior is crucial for preventing future incidents and for conservation efforts. Orcas aren't mindless killers. They're sophisticated predators with individual personalities and learning capabilities." After Dr. Morales left, promising to share her formal findings once completed, Mateo was left with more questions than answers. The scientific explanation made sense on one level, but it failed to capture the emotional reality of his experience. The terror, the helplessness, the sense of being evaluated by a mind both alien and undeniably intelligent. A week after the EEE attack, Mateo was discharged from the hospital with instructions for wound care, a prescription for antibiotics, and a referral for physical therapy. The puncture wounds were healing well, with no signs of infection, but the muscle damage would take months to fully repair. He walked with a pronounced limp and required the support of a cane, a humbling change for someone who had always prided himself on his physical capabilities. His apartment in Puerto Natales, a small but comfortable space overlooking the harbor, now felt different. From his window he could see the waters of the strait where he had spent so much of his life. The sight that had once filled him with anticipation and joy now triggered a reflexive tension in his body, a quickening of his pulse. His employer, a local tour company specializing in kayaking expeditions, had been supportive, assuring him that his job would be waiting when he was ready to return. But would he ever be ready? The thought of sitting in a kayak again, of feeling that vulnerability on the open water, sent cold sweat down his spine. In the weeks that followed, Mateo's physical healing progressed steadily. The puncture wounds closed, leaving puckered scars that stood out against his skin, permanent reminders of the orca's power. His muscles regained strength through carefully prescribed exercises, and gradually he was able to walk without the cane, though long distances still caused discomfort and a noticeable limp. The psychological healing proved more challenging. Sleep remained elusive, disrupted by vivid nightmares that left him gasping for breath, convinced he was underwater again with the orca's jaws around his leg. During waking hours, he found himself avoiding windows facing the water, startling at unexpected sounds, experiencing sudden surges of panic that seemed to come from nowhere. His friends noticed the changes, the way he would fall silent mid-conversation, his gaze becoming distant, how he flinched at the splash of water, his refusal to join gatherings at restaurants overlooking the strait. They tried to understand, to offer support without pushing, but the gap between their experience and his felt unbridgeable. 1 month after the attack, Mateo received a call from Dr. Morales. "I wanted to let you know that we've been tracking M47, she said. He rejoined his pod about 2 weeks ago and has moved further south toward the Drake Passage. He's showing normal behavior now, hunting with the group." "So he's gone?" Mateo asked, unsure whether the news brought relief or simply a hollow acknowledgement. "From this immediate area, yes. Orcas travel extensively, sometimes covering 100 kilometers in a day. They follow food sources and established migration patterns." "Could he come back?" "It's possible. This region is part of his pod's traditional range. But another attack would be extremely unlikely. Your experience was exceptional, possibly the result of a unique combination of circumstances." After hanging up, Mateo stood at his window for the first time in weeks, forcing himself to look out at the water. The strait appeared as it always had, beautiful, vast, indifferent to the dramas that played out upon and beneath its surface. Somewhere far to the south, the Orca continued its life, perhaps with no memory of their encounter, certainly with no concept of the lasting impact it had left on the human it had briefly toyed with. 2 months after the attack, Mateo's physical therapist suggested an important step in his recovery, returning to the water. Not in a kayak, not yet, but simply standing at the shore, then perhaps wading in shallow water where he could feel secure. "Avoidance reinforces fear," she explained gently, gradually reintroducing the source of anxiety in a controlled, safe manner can help recalibrate your response. It took another week before Mateo found the courage to try. He chose a small protected beach near town, arriving early when few people would be around to witness his struggle. The morning was clear, the water calm, conditions that would once have called him to paddle far into the strait. He approached the shoreline slowly, each step deliberate as he fought the instinct to turn back. At the water's edge, he stopped, his heart racing as if he had run a great distance. The gentle lapping of small waves against the shore seemed suddenly threatening, the vast expanse beyond filled with unseen dangers. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. "It's just water." But it wasn't just water, and no amount of rational self-talk could convince his body otherwise. His muscles remained tense, ready to flee, as memories of the attack flickered through his mind with visceral clarity. He forced himself to stay for 10 minutes, then returned the following day for 15, gradually extending the time until he could stand at the shore without his heart hammering against his ribs. Progress was incremental but real, each small victory building towards something larger. In his 3rd month of recovery, Mateo began seeing a psychologist who specialized in trauma. Dr. Navarro listened without judgment as he described not just the attack itself but the aftermath, the nightmares, the anxiety, the sense of alienation from friends who couldn't understand what he had experienced. "What you're describing is a normal response to an abnormal event," she told him. "Post-traumatic stress doesn't mean you're weak or broken. It means your brain and body are trying to protect you from a threat they perceive as ongoing." "But it's not ongoing," Mateo said. "The Orca is gone. I'm safe on land." The rational. Part of your brain knows that, but the survival mechanisms that helped our ancestors stay alive don't always respond to rational arguments. They work on associations, sensory input, emotional memory. Through their sessions, Mateo began to understand the physiology of his responses, how trauma rewired neural pathways, how triggers could activate a cascade of physical reactions before conscious thought had time to intervene. Knowledge didn't eliminate the symptoms, but it provided a framework for understanding them, for separating the reactions from his sense of self. 4 months after the attack, Matteo stood at the dock where he had launched his kayak that fateful morning. He wasn't ready to get back on the water, not yet, perhaps not ever in the same carefree way, but facing this specific location represented an important threshold in his recovery. Carlos found him there, gazing out at the strait as afternoon sunlight glittered across its surface. The old fisherman approached quietly, respecting Matteo's contemplation. "First time back?" he asked finally. Matteo nodded. "Feels strange." "I imagine it does." Carlos followed his gaze out to the water. "Been meaning to tell you something. My grandfather was Kaweskar on my mother's side. He had a saying about the Orca. He called it the one who knows what it does." "Seems accurate," Matteo replied with a bitter smile. He also said that to survive an encounter with such a creature was to be marked by it, to carry something of its spirit, not a curse but a kind of wisdom few receive. Matteo considered this. "I'm not sure I feel very wise. Mostly I feel changed." "That's the beginning of wisdom, isn't it? Recognizing that you're not the same person you were before." They stood in silence for a while longer, watching fishing boats return to the harbor as evening approached. The familiar sights and sounds of Puerto Natales continued around them. Tourists browsing shops, locals calling greetings to one another, seabirds circling hopefully near the fish market. Life had continued in its ordinary rhythms, while Matteo's personal world had been transformed. There was something both isolating and comforting in that realization. His experience was uniquely his own, yet the community that had always been his home remained steady, offering a foundation for whatever came next. 5 months after the attack, Dr. Morales invited Matteo to participate in an educational presentation she was giving about orcas in the Magellanic region. The audience would include local tour operators, kayak guides, and conservation officials. "Your first-hand account would be invaluable," she explained. "Not to sensationalize the incident, but to help people understand these animals better and to improve safety protocols for those who use these waters." Matteo hesitated, uncertain whether he was ready to revisit the experience so publicly. "What would you want me to say?" "Just your story, in your own words, the reality of what happened, without exaggeration or minimization. These animals deserve our respect, not our fear, but that respect must be informed by a complete understanding of their capabilities and behaviors." After careful consideration, Matteo agreed. The preparation was difficult, requiring him to organize and articulate memories he had been working to process rather than relive. Dr. Navarro helped him develop techniques to remain grounded while speaking, to recognize when anxiety was building, and how to continue without being overwhelmed by it. The presentation took place in a community center near the harbor. Matteo sat quietly as Dr. Morales shared scientific information about orca populations in the region, their social structures, hunting patterns, and the rare instances of human interaction globally. When it was his turn to speak, he approached the small podium with apprehension that gradually gave way to a sense of purpose. "Until March 12th of this year, I thought I understood these waters and the creatures in them," he began. "I had seen orcas many times from my kayak, always with admiration and never with fear. What happened that day changed my understanding, but not my belief that we can share these waters respectfully and safely." As he recounted his experience, Matteo was surprised to find that sharing it publicly was different from reliving it in isolation or even discussing it in therapy. The act of transforming his private trauma into a narrative that might help others created a distance, allowing him to observe the event rather than simply experiencing it again. The audience listened intently, their expressions reflecting shock, sympathy, and genuine interest. When he finished, their questions were thoughtful and respectful, focused on practical safety measures and a deeper understanding of the behavior he had witnessed. "Would you kayak again?" one young guide asked. Matteo considered the question carefully. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Not yet. But I believe in respecting fear without being controlled by it. The strait has been my home all my life. I'm not ready to surrender that completely." After the presentation, Several attendees approached to thank him, to share their own experiences with marine wildlife, to express admiration for his willingness to speak about something so difficult. The connections formed that evening, the sense of being understood and of contributing something valuable from his ordeal, marked another step in his healing process. 6 months after the attack, news reached Puerto Natales that the orca known as M47 had been spotted far to the north near Chiloé Island, still traveling with its pod. The distance, over 1,000 kilometers, provided a strange comfort to Mateo. The creature that had so profoundly altered his life was continuing its own journey, separated from him by time and space, yet still connected through the enduring impact of their brief, violent intersection. That same week, Mateo's physical therapist officially discharged him from regular treatment. His leg had healed remarkably well, with approximately 90% of previous function restored. The scars remained prominent, a series of curved puncture marks where the orca's teeth had gripped him, and broader areas of tissue damage from the impact trauma. But the pain had subsided to occasional discomfort, primarily during changes in weather or after extensive use. "You've made exceptional progress," the therapist told him. "Much faster than I expected given the severity of the injury." "Does that mean I could kayak again? Physically, I mean." "From a purely physical perspective, yes, with proper conditioning to rebuild the specific muscle groups involved. The question is whether you want to." The question lingered with Mateo as he walked along the shore that evening. The waters of the strait reflected the spectacular colors of a Patagonian sunset, orange and pink giving way to deepening blue. Fishing boats returned to harbor for the night, their running lights creating trails across the darkening surface. He had spent 6 months focused on recovery, physical therapy 3 times a week, psychological counseling, gradual exposure to triggers, rebuilding a life around the reality of what had happened rather than attempting to return to what was before. The progress was real and significant, but so was the enduring change in how he perceived the world, particularly the water that had always been central to his identity. 7 months after the attack, Mateo returned to work at the tour company, though in a modified role that didn't require him to lead kayaking expeditions. Instead, he helped with logistics, equipment maintenance, and training new guides, sharing his extensive knowledge of the region's waters, weather patterns, and wildlife. His employer, Maria, had held the position for him as promised, understanding that his expertise remained valuable even if he couldn't yet return to his previous duties. "The water is patient," she told him. "It will wait for you to be ready, whether that's months from now or never." The tour company operated from a building overlooking the harbor, meaning Mateo now spent his days within sight of the strait. At first, this constant visual reminder triggered anxiety, but gradually the familiar view began to reclaim some of its former beauty as he observed it from a distance, establishing a new relationship with the environment that had both nurtured and nearly killed him. The other guides treated him with a mixture of sympathy and reverence. His experience had transformed him into something of a local legend, his story retold with varying degrees of accuracy among both residents and tourists. Some seemed disappointed when they met him and discovered not a swaggering survivor with dramatic tales, but a quiet, thoughtful man still working through the aftermath of trauma. 8 months after the attack, Dr. Morales published a paper about the incident in a marine biology journal, incorporating Mateo's account along with tracking data from M47 and behavioral observations of the orca, both before and after the encounter. She sent Mateo a copy with a handwritten note. "Your experience, difficult as it was, has contributed significantly to our understanding of these complex predators. Knowledge is how we transform fear into respect, and respect is the foundation of conservation. Thank you for your courage in sharing your story." The paper presented several theories about the attack, ranging from mistaken identity, the orca briefly perceiving the kayak as potential prey, to play behavior gone wrong, to a deliberate investigation of an unfamiliar object. It concluded that while the incident was unusual, it highlighted the need for continued research into orca cognition and behavior, as well as improved safety guidelines for small watercraft in areas where these predators were common. Reading: The clinical analysis of what had been the most terrifying experience of his life produced a strange disconnection in Matteo. The scientific language, predatory investigation sequence, and tactile examination behavior, novel object response, seemed simultaneously accurate and utterly inadequate to describe the reality of being in the water with a creature whose intelligence was directed toward treating him as an object of curiosity or practice. 9 months after the attack, Matteo stood at the shore on the anniversary of his father's death. Antonio Alvarez had been a fisherman, lost at sea during a sudden storm when Matteo was just 16. It was his father who had first taught him to kayak, who had instilled in him both respect for the water and confidence in his ability to navigate it. "I don't know if I can go back, Dad," he said quietly, addressing the strait as he did each year on this day. "Not the way you taught me, not with the same trust." The water offered no answer, only the steady rhythm of small waves against the shore. Matteo had never believed his father could hear him during these one-sided conversations, but the ritual provided connection to the man whose love of these waters had shaped his own path. For the first time, Matteo found himself wondering if his father had experienced moments of terror in his final hours, if he too had found himself at the mercy of forces greater than human skill or preparation could counter. The thought created a new dimension to his grief, a deeper empathy with the man whose absence had defined so much of his life. 10 months after the attack, Carlos invited Matteo to join him on his fishing boat, not to work, simply to be on the water again in a vessel larger and safer than a kayak. "No pressure," the old fisherman assured him. "Just an invitation. The offer stands whenever you're ready." Matteo considered it carefully, discussing the possibility with Dr. Navarro in their now bi-weekly sessions. It would be a significant step, she acknowledged, but also a controlled one, with someone you trust, in a situation where you'd have more security than in a kayak. A week later, Matteo accepted. The morning they set out was clear and calm. Ideal conditions that should have been reassuring, but instead heightened his anxiety as he remembered similar conditions on the day of the attack. His hands trembled slightly as he boarded Carlos's boat, a sturdy vessel about 10 meters in length that had worked these waters for decades. "We won't go far," Carlos promised, noting Matteo's tension. Just enough to feel the rhythm again. As they motored away from the harbor, Matteo gripped the gunwale with white-knuckled intensity, his body rigid as he scanned the water obsessively for any sign of a dorsal fin. Carlos maintained a respectful silence, focusing on navigation while allowing his passenger the space to process whatever emotions arose. They reached a point perhaps 2 kilometers from shore when Carlos cut the engine, allowing the boat to drift gently in the current. "This is far enough for today," he said, moving to drop a fishing line over the side. "No agenda. We'll stay as long or as short as you want." Matteo nodded, still unable to relax fully, but beginning to adjust to the sensation of being on the water again. The familiar sounds, water lapping against the hull, seabirds calling overhead, the distant drone of other boats, had once been the backdrop to his happiest moments. Now they carried complex associations, both comforting and threatening. An hour passed as Carlos fished quietly, and Matteo gradually allowed himself to settle into the experience. He found that being on the strait again was both worse and better than he had imagined. The fear was present, but not overwhelming. The beauty still accessible beneath the anxiety. "There," Carlos said suddenly, pointing to a disturbance in the water about 100 meters away. "Dolphins, I think." Matteo followed his gesture and saw several sleek forms cutting through the surface. Commerson's dolphins, a species common to these waters. Their distinctive black and white coloration triggered a momentary spike of panic before his rational mind identified them correctly. "Beautiful," he managed to say, his heart rate slowly returning to normal as he watched their graceful movements. "Life goes on out here," Carlos said simply, "with or without us." That first trip lasted only a few hours, but it represented a crucial threshold. Matteo had returned to the strait, had faced the environment that had become synonymous with terror in his mind, and had found that while the fear remained, it was not the only possible response. The water still held beauty, still moved according to patterns he had known since childhood, still connected him to his history and community. In the weeks that followed, he joined Carlos several more times, each trip extending a bit further from shore, each experience building a layer of new associations to counterbalance the traumatic ones. He was not the same person who had confidently launched his kayak 11 months earlier. That version of himself was gone, transformed by his encounter with the Orca. But perhaps the person emerging from that transformation carried a deeper understanding, a more nuanced relationship with the natural world and its inherent risks. 11 months after the attack, Mateo received an unexpected letter from a woman in British Columbia, Canada. She had read Dr. Morales's paper and recognized similarities to an experience her brother had 15 years earlier while kayaking near Vancouver Island. "He survived his encounter with an orca, just as you did," she wrote. "The physical wounds healed, but the experience changed him profoundly. He never kayaked again but found a new relationship with the ocean as a marine conservation advocate. I thought knowing you're not alone in this very rare experience might offer some comfort." The letter included contact information, an invitation to correspond if Mateo wished. He sat with the knowledge for several days, contemplating the strange connection to a stranger thousands of kilometers away who nonetheless might understand aspects of his experience that even his closest friends could not. Eventually, he wrote back, sharing parts of his story that hadn't made it into the scientific paper. The nightmares, the way unexpected sounds could trigger panicked responses, the struggle to reconcile his love for the water with his fear of what lay beneath its surface. The correspondence that developed became another thread in his recovery, another way of processing what had happened and imagining possible futures beyond it. 12 months after the attack, on a clear March morning similar to the one that had changed his life, Mateo stood at the dock where he had launched his kayak exactly 1 year earlier. The physical scars on his leg had faded from angry red to silvery white, though they remained clearly visible. The psychological scars had evolved as well, still present but transformed from raw wounds into something that, if not healed, had at least become integrated into his sense of self. He was not there to kayak, not yet. That decision remained uncertain, a question he revisited regularly without pressure for resolution. But he had brought with him a small wreath of local wildflowers, a private ritual to mark the anniversary. As he tossed the wreath onto the water, watching as the current gradually carried it toward the open strait, Mateo reflected on the year that had passed. He had lost much, his confidence in the water, his sense of invulnerability, the simple joy of paddling freely through the landscape he loved. But he had gained as well, a deeper appreciation for life's fragility, stronger connections with those who had supported his recovery, a humility before natural forces that no human could fully control or predict. The Orca M47 continued its life somewhere in the vast waters off the Chilean coast. Periodic reports of sightings reached Puerto Natales through the network of marine researchers, each confirming that the animal had returned to normal behavioral patterns within its pod. In scientific terms, the attack had been an anomaly, a statistically insignificant event in the broader study of orca-human interactions. But science could not fully capture the human dimension of that encounter, how it had forced Mateo to confront mortality, to rebuild a life around new limitations and possibilities, to find meaning in an experience that had no easy explanations. The orca had not been malevolent in any human sense, just as it had not been compassionate when it ultimately released him and moved on. It had simply been what it was, a highly evolved predator acting according to instincts and intelligence, shaped by millions of years of evolution in an environment where humans were recent and rare visitors. As the wreath disappeared from view, carried by the same currents that had flowed beneath his kayak a year before, Mateo turned back toward Puerto Natales. The small town spread along the shore, its buildings familiar, its rhythms unchanged by his private anniversary. Life continued as it always did, requiring only that he continue with it, finding his way forward one day at a time. The waters of the Strait of Magellan stretched to the horizon, a constant presence that had shaped the region's history and the lives of those who called it home. Matteo knew now that he would never view those waters with the same unburdened joy that had once been his. The knowledge of what they contained, the power, the intelligence, the potential for both beauty and danger, had been carved into him as surely as the orca's teeth had marked his flesh. But he also knew that his relationship with the strait was not finished, merely transformed. Whether he would kayak again remained uncertain, a decision not yet ready to be made. What was certain was that the water would remain central to his identity, his community, his understanding of himself in the world. The wreath was gone, the ritual complete. Matteo turned and walked back into town, his slight limp a reminder with each step of what had been lost and what had been gained. Behind him, the strait continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human dramas that played out upon and within it, yet connected to them through the complex web of life it sustained. The Orca, wherever it swam now, moved through waters connected to these, part of a single vast ocean that covered most of the planet. The thought no longer filled Matteo with paralyzing fear, but with a complex mixture of respect, awe, and caution. Emotions better suited to navigating a world where beauty and danger often coexisted, where understanding was always partial, and where moving forward required acknowledging rather than denying the forces beyond human control. It had been exactly 1 year. The story of the attack was complete, recorded in scientific literature and local legend. The story of its aftermath, of how Matteo would ultimately integrate this experience into the continuing narrative of his life, was still being written, one day at a time, with each step that carried him forward.